Welcome, developers, to React. I um, I recently, well, not recently, a year ago, I put out a Node series on how to set up a Node server, and many of you had asked me if I would put together a React series for beginning developers from a perspective of someone who was a beginner himself and who needs things explained to me the way that I believe or that I wish that had been explained to me that I think that beginners need to hear. So without any further ado, let's open up. I'm going to use, instead of doing like we did in the Node project, instead of doing one big long project over 22 videos, the React series is really going to be a series of short videos on different topics or different things that you can do in React instead of one big project. Node lent itself to building it the way we did because we were learning new features as we went. With React, we're just going to you learn best by doing. So we're just going to build a bunch of little tiny things just to get used to the whole React world. So without any further ado, I use Code Sandbox when I want to do something real quick in React. They it's free, and you can check out, you can get your feet wet with React. And then later on in the series, we'll use Create React App and we'll use a code editor and stuff like that. But for right now, just to explain concepts, let's use Code Sandbox. So React is one of the most commonly used libraries for building apps today. Before React, Angular, made by Google, kind of had the most market share, but Google is very opinionated. It wants you to do things a very particular way, and that's not to everybody's liking. And the alternative prior to the Angular was jQuery, and jQuery was like a magical step forward compared to just using JavaScript and straight DOM manipulation. What is the DOM? The DOM is the document object model. It is what your web browser uses to display information on the screen. And so, we know HTML and we know CSS, but if you want your web page to be interactive at all in any way, shape, or form to allow the user to interact with it, then you need JavaScript. The cool thing is all web browsers, they speak JavaScript. That's the language that all browsers speak. That's why we use JavaScript so much. Some people are like, JavaScript's a bad language. Why don't we use another language? Well, all the web browsers speak JavaScript, and that's all they speak. So we are stuck with JavaScript for probably quite some time until something else comes out, which would be a massive shift, um, paradigm shift in web development. Um, why React? What problem is React trying to solve? Well, React, as we know, was built by the Facebook team, and Facebook, as you can imagine, like an Instagram app or a Facebook app or even a Twitter app, all the data that's changing and updating, and the interactive users are, those apps are massively interactive with the user, and so if you had to do those apps using straight DOM manipulation and JavaScript, it would be a very cumbersome code base, very hard to maintain, and just not a lot of fun for a developer. Writing code is hard enough, but then reading other people's code, that's way difficult because everybody thinks a little different. So, and as we go along, we're going to talk about best practices as far as comments and things like that. So the React team at Facebook developed React in-house to use as a tool to build their their Facebook apps, and it's been a raving success ever since. More and more and more developers keep jumping on board. And why are they jumping on board? Because it is just so darn flexible. React is very powerful, very unopinionated. All React is concerned about is displaying information in the most efficient, um, way possible, and it doesn't really care where the data comes from. You hit an API and you pull in a bunch of data, and then as long as the data's coming in, then React, it gets to work, putting things out. So we're going to talk about React's concept with components. What is a component? A component is really nothing more than a little chunk of code that does one thing really well, or just a few things very well, and it contrasts that to an app that is massive with big functions that have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines in them. And then if you need to do any update to that function at all, it becomes very difficult to have to maintain that, especially in a large code base. So the whole concept with React is build smaller components and then build up your app, almost like building blocks, building boxes. And for instance, we'll have a component called a nav bar. And once we build it, it's built. And anytime you want to display a nav bar, we just point to that component and it'll print, or it'll show on the screen. Same thing, we can have a header, we can have different imagine all the different parts of an Instagram screen or a Facebook screen. Each of those little separate things are little components, each and of themselves, that are stuck on the page. And so React lends itself to good programming practices with like writing in components. A component is nothing more than a function. For instance, like when we start up Code Sandbox, we have right here, we're given, well, first of all, let me talk about the libraries. Here's the React, whoops, I didn't want to click on that. Here's the React library. We're up at 1702. I learned on version 16 point ... The 17 upgrade was mainly an internal upgrade, nothing for the developers, no added features for the developer-facing side. Basically, they're getting React ready for a major upgrade, and they needed to do some things under the cover, and that's why this version 17 came out, to help pave the way for the next release, which will have changes for us. The React DOM, this is the library that the React team built that's responsible for interacting with the real DOM. What React has done is, knowing that working with the DOM is really hard, is they created an engine called the virtual DOM. It basically is the same thing as the DOM, and it interacts with the DOM for us. So in other words, in the old days, we used to write JavaScript to directly manipulate the DOM. Now we write JavaScript. It creates a React DOM, and then that React DOM talks to the DOM. And what's so special about that? Well, in the old days, if you had one little change on your web page, the entire page had to refresh, and that was not performant at all, especially if there's a lot of information that has to go over the line. And so with the React DOM talking to the direct DOM, basically only the part of the screen that it changes is changed, and then the React takes care of that under the covers for us. The other cool thing about React is it combines JavaScript and what looks like HTML right here into one file. Some developers don't like this. Some consider this a clear case of a clash of concerns. Everyone kind of defines concerns a little differently, though. I mean, the old way of thinking is you have HTML file, that's one concern. You have a CSS file for styling, that's another concern. And you have JavaScript, that's another concern. But React looked at it and said, that's a separation of concerns from a developer point of view, from like maybe structuring your app. But a separation of concerns from the actual app itself is, for instance, if I have a button, well, then maybe I create a function that makes a button, and then I'll put inside of that function any JavaScript that does any behavior when I click on that button. And that bundles it all in one place, and I have a component called a button component, and that is one concern, everything having to do with a button. And so that's the React's view, And it is a little bit of a paradigm shift for some people, but it's one that is grabbed the most market share of the web app development tools. So um, let me see, what else can I explain here? Okay, there's a couple rules with components and functions in React. A React component is, like you see right here, basically just a function. This export default makes it so that this function can be used in other files. So later on, if I point to this app, then having this export default means that this is the export, whatever this return is, out of here. A React component has to begin with a capital letter. That tells the React library that this is a component versus just a regular function. And as you can see, other than that, it's function app, just like a regular JavaScript app. Another thing, a React component has to return something. You can't leave out the return statement. Some functions, for instance, like, in JavaScript don't necessarily have to return anything, but in a component, a React component, you have to return something. You can only return one thing. So that's why we have surrounded this. See, we got a div and then an h1 and an h2, and those are three things. But if we surround it all with parentheses, then we can return that one thing. And it basically gets returned as one object. Okay, this part right here, this is the part that is magic, or this is the part that kind of distinguishes React from like an Angular or from straight JavaScript HTML code bases, is this stuff that looks an awful lot like HTML. And 90% of the time the tags are going to be exactly the same. But what they are really is, this is JSX. It's React sort of syntactical sugar language. I think JSX means JavaScript extensible language. It's like XML. It's basically like for those of you old developers that have been around a while that know XML, where you could make up your own tags. It's kind of like XML, and this is what allows us to combine HTML looking things in a JavaScript function. It's combining the two that is the React part. But there are a few differences. For instance, you notice right here it says class name app, where in HTML it's just class. Well, we had to have class name because, as you know, JavaScript, the word class is a reserved word, just like the word string or number, or const or let. There's certain reserved words in JavaScript that we can't use, and class is one of them. So this is one of the differences. We have to put class name. And usually other HTML tag attributes that have like a dash in them. Like, I can't think of any off the top of my head, darn it. But like, for instance, let's say there's an HTML attribute that has a tag like that. Well, in React, they all get flipped to camel case. You get rid of the dash, and all the attributes of these JSX tags get camel cased. So let's just kind of start from the beginning here. We have an index.html. This is just HTML. On this HTML, you can include like font files and things up here in the head, just like normal. You can also use the CSS files like they have right here, or you can do CSS in the JavaScript, which is becoming increasingly more popular. I think I'm going to be going to that myself, although I've used a lot of CSS files just because it's so familiar and so easy to use. But down here, this HTML file has a body with one div in it, and that's it. And it has an ID called root, and there's nothing in between the div tags. And so this div right here on this HTML page, when the app starts to run, it looks for this index.js file, and the React DOM library is included because we're going to use this to connect to the DOM. And so, right here we have document.getElement by ID. This is the old JavaScript way that we used to interact with the DOM for everything. Well, with React, we use it one time, usually one time, to get this root tag into a variable. Get this root tag right here. Get this. We're getting this right here in JavaScript. So that's what we're getting right here. And that div tag right here is, if I were to do a console log on this variable, it would basically show me this right here. And so we're saying, okay, let's get that root element, and now we're going to render, and we're going to stick app. Strict mode has to do with the JavaScript language. JavaScript in the old days could be a little loosey-goosey, especially with like using var instead of like let and const, and strict mode applies just a more stringent structure to JavaScript. If you want to learn more, just Google it, and you'll find all kinds of cool stuff that'll go into details. But that's basically what strict mode is. But render, basically we're saying, render, stick the app where the root element is. See this root element? So it's sticking app right in the middle of these two tags. So your entire React app gets plugged in right there. That's all we use index.html for. We don't create web pages in HTML with React. We just have this one index.html. This basically is the entry point for our React app. And then this index.js wires it up. Almost every React app, the index.js is going to look similar to just this exactly right here. It's going to say, hey, let's get the React DOM. Let's create our virtual DOM that we're going to create. And let's import. Remember when I said on app we had export default? That allows us to import app into this file, into here from app. And we stuck that app, and we're sticking whatever we have in an app, we're sticking in between those two tags. And this is the div with this app stuck in the middle of it. And so let's go to app, and then here we go. And we can change anything. We can get rid of this, and then it goes away. So this is React. And on the next video, we're going to create a very, very simple app where we talk about state, and we're gonna create a traffic light app where we click a button and it goes from red to yellow to green, so we can start to explain the concept of component and state. So I'm very glad that you're here and you're going to join me. And as always, any comments or suggestions, please feel free to include them in the comments. I try to go through them at least once a week, and I look forward to having you along for this React journey.